Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks to Peter Fasching for his very kind introduction. I must tell you that he and me met for the first time 20 years ago. So many things of the one he has told is because he is my friend, not by my own merits. So I'm going to talk to you about the relationships between nutritional facts and functional decline in older people. We know some things, but we know more than those that we know. For doing so, I put my attention on 4 main bullets and try to reach some few conclusions about what we know and about what we ignore. The first thing I would like to address is what is the real problem nowadays when we face an older patient in our external office or the bed or whatever. Because as Professor Fasching has shown to you, we have still increasing our life expectancy, but with the minimum probabilities of increasing it significantly. He has told that world life expectancy will increase in 5 years, but it's not be in Europe. In Europe, probably it will increase in no more than 3 years. Take it into account that in the past century, we gained 50 years. You know that at the beginning of the century, the life expectancy was 30 years, and at the end of the century were 80 years. To increase our life expectancy in only 3 additional years is not very relevant. So if we are not going to increase life expectancy, which is the new target for our interventions in older people. It's quite clear for us as geriatricians, and more for everybody, that longevity as a target should be substituted by functional status, independency, autonomy. All of us want to live many years, but only if our many years lived are like those of the man in the left, but not those of the man in the right. And this is in a scenario where there is a limit to human lifespan, a limit that we are very close to achieve. There is a second question. Take it into account that function is more relevant than increased life expectancy. What is the role of disease when you are old? Is more important to attend the disease or to attend the functional impairment? Probably one of the best things to bear in mind is how older people live their diseases. When you are young, you only have one disease with clear symptoms. When you are old, there is a mixed emerging of the transformations, the changes due to the aging process per se, plus those due to your lifestyle, mainly physical exercise and nutrition, and also diseases, clinical and subclinical diseases. All of them are manifested by functional changes. And this means that as older you are, more important is functioning and less important is disease. When you make explanation models about different outcomes and your population is older, it's a very constant finding that disease alone or in the term of comorbidity is able to account less outcomes than is function. This is a constant finding when you introduce function in these models. And this is increasingly promoting a change in the biomedical paradigm. Still now, in the School of Medicine, pupils are taught that their function is to save lives. When the trainees in geriatrics come to my department, the first thing I tell to them is, you are not going to save lives, but you are going to increase the quality of life of the years lived by your older patients. And this is very important. And in fact, now The challenge is not to increase life expectancy, but to increase optimal longevity. That means the years lived in good conditions, to compress the health span. In this conceptual framework, WHO in 2015 published a very nice book, very nice report called Aging and Health, where they define healthy aging in terms of functioning. Healthy aging was defined as the process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being in older age. No mention to diseases. And this is the conceptual framework of the WHO. For doing this, it defined two other concepts: intrinsic capacity and the challenges on the environment. The intrinsic capacity refers to the combination of one's physical and mental ability. Is what I am able to do. And depending upon the environmental challenges, I will develop or not this ability. I'm pretty sure that all of us are not disabled for crossing the street, but many of us are absolutely disabled for climbing to the Aconcagua mountain. So disability is not a whole concept. It's a dialectical concept depending upon the task and your intrinsic capacity. And this intrinsic capacity is going to be dominated by these three domains: primary aging, lifestyle, and diseases. This intrinsic capacity goes down along the life. When we are young and we are adult in our median life, we don't experience any significant changes. But as we approach to the line of disability, we have to start some problems in doing some tasks. If we have to run to take the bus, it takes more time. And after taking it, our breath is not so good during more time than when we were 12, 20, or 30 years. This time is accompanied not only by a decrease in our functional reserve, but also with a decrease in our possibility to respond to demands. As a consequence, the possibility of reverting the condition is going lower and lower and lower. So if we wait to cross the line, it is very difficult to restore our robustness, our functional independence. And this is the time for what has been called frailty. Frailty syndrome is that time when we still have some functional reserve, we have possibilities for recovery, but if we do not act, in few time we are going to become disabled with very few possibilities of restoring our functional status. And again, this frailty syndrome is the clinical manifestation of many underlying diseases, many underlying conditions due to the lifestyle, and many underlying conditions due to the aging process per se. All of them as a whole are expressed as frailty syndrome. That can be measured. What is underlying this frailty? This is a very classical slide with the frailty cycle defined more than 20 years ago by the group of Linda Fried in Johns Hopkins in the United States. As you can see, many things are contributing to frailty, and one of them, in a very relevant position, is chronic undernutrition. This chronic undernutrition is going to impact, of course, on muscle mass, of course, on muscle function, but also on muscle-related metabolic impairment, producing several changes in the metabolism, not directly related only to muscle, but also to some hormone, for instance, insulin resistance, that altogether are going to impact on the possibility of functioning, producing frailty. What we know about nutritional facts in older people? We know quite huge things in people, older people at the hospital, and in older people in nursing homes. But they are very important, but in fact they represent data on no more than 5% of all the populations. What about the remaining 95% of all the people who is living at home and also suffering the consequences of poor nutrition and malnutrition? Consequences that are clearly linked and also are going to, in some way, condition how is the prognosis of these older people when he or she is admitted to the hospital. There are very few data. I'm showing here you probably the most important meta-analysis assessing this condition. And if you can see, there are only 19. This is 2017. There have been some new data, but at that time there were only 19 studies. Only 5 of them were longitudinal, and they assessed very different things with the same outcome of frailty: micronutrients, macronutrients, dietary habits, diet quality, very separate things. And when you go to the 5 longitudinal studies, each of them is approaching several risk factors, all of them related to nutrition, but absolutely different outcomes. So we faced this challenge 3 years ago, and these are our results on the Toledo study of healthy aging. That it's a cohort around 1,600 older adults followed during a mean of 6.5 years, and we clearly find that malnutrition, not only malnutrition, but risk of malnutrition, adding malnutrition at risk of malnutrition means 30% of the whole population living in the community, was significantly and positively associated with the probability of being frail 3.5 years later. When you go to the next step, remember you have robust frailty, disability, and then death. The results are not so clear. We have not convincing data in the community. I'm talking always in the community, because of 2 main reasons. First, the way of defining what malnutrition is, and second, how I can measure disability. Very recently, it has been published, this study showing that BMI is the 4th or 5th factor conditioning the disability-free survival in big populations. This means, or this suggests, that malnutrition is very important, but we have still to determine the importance of this fact. And more recently, in the Newcastle 85+ study, they have shown in this very old population that nutrition is a risk factor for developing earlier disability. And this has been shown assessing protein intake. And this is not dependent on the physical exercise group, because this role is observed no matter the physical exercise that these very old people is doing. And finally, what about death? As you can see in this slide, in this same study that I have shown you previously with the data of the Toledo study of healthy aging, it's quite clear that malnutrition, but not to be at risk of malnutrition, predict the risk of death. This is interesting because it looks that there is a dose-response relationship. When you are at risk of malnutrition, you have at high risk for developing frailty and disability, and when you are malnourished, you are at high risk for dying. So it looks that there is a clear dose-response relationship. But what about micronutrients? We have told about malnutrition, but all of us have the feeling that many people not meeting criteria for malnutrition are undernourished or poorly nourished, and they are deficient in some of the micronutrients. We now know quite clearly that we have some micronutrients protecting frailty. This is the case for vitamin D. This is the case of resveratrol. And what about proteins? The data about proteins are clearly controversial. We have data showing that they protect, But we also have data suggesting that they are a risk factor for developing frailty. But when we go an additional step, we are able to differentiate. It looks that the quality of the protein is very important in protecting or increasing the risk for frailty. And it looks that red meat, the proteins in the red meat, are the one that can explain, that can account the risk of increased frailty, while other proteins from other origins, both animal and vegetables, but not red meat, are protecting of them. In this study, published this year, in 85,000 women, the NARS health study, they have shown that when they replace one serving day of unprocessed red meat with any other protein sources, the benefits are quite clear, suggesting, this is an observational study, suggesting that the proteins not coming from red meat also are protective from frailty in this very, very big cohort. And I am finishing. What to do? Very recently, WHO has proposed the ICOP, Integrated Care for Older People program, who is focused in detecting the very early stages on the functional deterioration through the checking of 6 domains. One of these 6 domains is vitality, but it assesses really nutritional status. After screening and diagnosing, there is a proposal for intervention, doing a health plan, and an implementation of this health plan to recover, to act on this risk factor. This is the slide showing the domain of vitality, focused mainly on nutrition. I am not going to talk more about this because, fortunately, we have here to Dr. Mario Soto that is going to dedicate all his time to talk to you about the first data, the very first data that we have about ICOP in older people. So this is my last slide, simply to remember you that the impairment of intrinsic capacity leads to loss of autonomy, and it's a very relevant issue to be taken into account. There is a clear association, both cross-sectional and longitudinal, between functional status and nutritional status. Early identification of malnutrition is key to reduce the incidence of frailty. Nutritional status is core for preserving intrinsic capacity. The plan of care should include multiple interventions, not only focus on nutritional facts, but also in physical exercise in order to preserve autonomy in older people. And finally, ICOP strategy is a promising and comprehensive program promoted by WHO to cope with nutritional deficits in older people. Thank you for your attention.